how your heart beats and in what order does it beat. And then we're going to talk about blood pressure and how those two are related. So in this lesson, we're going to look at heartbeat and blood pressure and how they're related. I want to start out by talking about how your heart beats. And your heartbeat has a conducting system. So it's going to conduct electricity across the heart, and it's going to send out an electrical signal. So your muscles respond to electrical signals. For instance, I've never been tased myself, but I heard it hurts. And the reason why it hurts is because when you get tased, or when your body gets filled with an electrical shock, it tells your whole body to contract your muscles. So every muscle in your body contracts at once. So it causes that muscular contraction. So just like that, your heart responds to an electrical signal. And this is also why that we shock the heart whenever somebody has a heart attack, or whenever somebody's heart stops beating or has a wildly irregular rhythm. We shock it in hopes that that electrical signal can restart the normal electrical signal of the heart and get it beating normally again. So here's how that conducting system works. So here's our heart, and the conducting system is controlled by two major components of the heart. It's controlled by what's called the SA node, and it's located right there where I put that black circle. And it's also another part called the AV node, located between the right atria and right ventricle. So it's these two, along with another part called Purkinje fibers, that are going to conduct electricity across the heart, causing those muscle cells to contract. So it's these three things that sort of work in concert to make the heart contract. And it does this on its own. It doesn't need your brain. So if your heart becomes disconnected, there is a nerve that innervates your heart. But if that's to become disconnected, your heart will still beat on its own rhythm because of this SA node and AV node. So these are internal pacemakers of the heart. So how it works is this. First step, what's going to happen is that SA node is going to fire. So it's going to send out a signal. Kabam, it's going to fire. And because of that, it sort of makes these atria start to contract. The atria are getting ready to contract. They want to contract. Then the next thing that happens is the SA node is going to send that signal out, the electrical signal, in a wave, essentially, towards the AV node. So that electrical signal goes out towards the AV node. After it's traveled across the atria, that makes step 3 happen, and that's going to cause these atria to contract. So they're going to contract, pushing the blood through these valves and into the ventricles. Okay, so that's step 3. Step 4, this signal now at the SA node, now at the AV node, is going to travel along the septum down here to sort of the base of the heart, where we find those Purkinje fibers. And those Purkinje fibers are going to set up step 5. Those Purkinje fibers are going to set up the signal along the sides of the heart, and that's going to cause these ventricles to contract, pushing the blood through the semilunar valves out towards these different arteries. So that's the heart contraction signal that happens. That's important to know. Make sure you know these steps. Make sure you know how the SA node and the AV node are involved. Okay, if we take a look at that, this cycle here, or this cardiac wave that happens and sets up these contractions, sets up a cycle. So your heart beats in a cycle, and we call that cycle the cardiac cycle. And the cardiac cycle contains a couple of major components. And the first one is systole, and that's contraction, and diastole, which is relaxation. So systole is when the ventricles or atria contract, and diastole is when they relax. So it's these two components, so make sure you know those terms as well. So if we look at this, what's going to happen up here? If I just take a look at this picture here. So right up here, we have, we're just going to look at a ventricle. So here's diastole, and in diastole, the ventricle relaxes. And because of that, it causes these semilunar valves here to open up, and blood comes pouring into the heart. It also causes these semilunar valves over here, atrioventricular valve here, semilunar valve over here. It causes these semilunar valves to close so that no blood can rush back in. So the AV valves open, the ventricle relaxes in diastole and the semilunar valves close. Then the next thing that happens in systole, that's contraction. And in systole, the ventricle contracts, and it makes this valve, the atrioventricular valve, close here. So it closes so that blood cannot rush back into the atria. And then it causes these semilunar valves to open as the blood comes rushing through. So that's just the ventricle. We're just talking about the ventricle, diastole, and systole. And so that's sort of what happens in that cardiac cycle. That's part of a bigger picture. Part of a bigger picture. It's part of this big cardiac cycle that we're going to take a look at here. So I would definitely know this. Oops, I moved too fast. So if we take a look up here, here's our heart. And down here is time. So as time goes on, at time 0, and then we're going to go into fractions of a second. So for what happens, if we look at just the atria here, if we look at this, the atria are going to contract, right? Systole. And they're going to contract for 1/10 of a second. And then for 9/10 of a second, those atria are going to relax. So the atria contract, and then they relax. So they contract, they push these valves open, the blood rushes into the ventricles, and then they relax. Well, as they relax, so right after this line, right after they relax, the ventricles go into systole. The ventricles contract. So the atria are going to contract, pushing the blood into the ventricles, and then the ventricles are going to contract. And as those ventricles contract, they're going to push the blood out into the arteries. And then at about 4 seconds, or almost half a second, 4/10 of a second, they are going to start to relax. And they're going to relax all the way until right after, they're going to continue to relax here, and they're going to relax right up until the atria contract again. So the atria contract, they relax. As soon as the atria is done contracting, the ventricles contract. And that's because of that electrical signal traveling down the heart. Okay, so the electrical signal starts in the atria, causes the atria to contract, and as soon as those atria are done contracting, they relax. They go into diastole, and then as soon as the atria are done contracting, the ventricles go into systole, and then they go into diastole and relax afterwards. Okay, so that is what we call the cardiac cycle. It's this cycle of systole and diastole, and diastole and systole between these atria and ventricles, and making sure that they happen at exactly the right times to make sure that the blood goes from the atria into the ventricle, and then the blood gets pushed out of the ventricles. Okay, just a little short bit on blood pressure. So I'm sure you went to the doctor and had your blood pressure taken, and the common is 120/80. And what we're measuring is actually, if we look at a blood vessel here, and this is a blood vessel, but if we look at that blood vessel, it's how much pressure is being put on these arteries here. And it's being put on these, and the amount of pressure is measured in 2 numbers. And we'll look at a lab in which we do this. But blood pressure is measured in 2 numbers. The first number is called ventricular systolic pressure. So this is what happens. This 120 is the number of pressure that's in your blood vessels when the ventricles are contracting, when the ventricles are in systole. Okay? The second number, diastolic, so 120/80, that's your diastole, or your diastolic pressure, and that's what's happening when your ventricles are relaxing. So right here is your systolic pressure and your diastolic pressure, because your pressure is going to change. When your ventricles are contracting, when they're pushing the blood out really forcefully, your blood pressure goes up, and then your blood pressure sort of drops back into this diastolic pressure. Okay, so that's blood pressure. And real quick, heart sounds, I just wanted to touch on this so you know what they are, so you have an idea. Your heart makes 2 sounds. And so when you hear your heartbeat, you have that lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub sound. And what you're actually hearing in those sounds is you're hearing these, the valves closing and then contraction. So the first sound, the lub. So in the lub-dub, lub-dub, the lub sound is these AV valves right here. These AV valves, they're closing, so they're slamming shut, and then your ventricles are contracting. So down here, so the blood's getting pushed out this way. So these slam shut, and then the blood gets pushed out this way. The second sound, the dup, or lub dup, is what happens when these valves close. So you're hearing these valves close, and then this is refilling with blood from here. So you're hearing the ventricles. So the first sound, the lub, is the contraction of the ventricle, and these valves closing. And then you're hearing these valves close, and then you're hearing the ventricle fill up with blood. So those are the heart sounds you're hearing. That ends the lesson for today, class. Make sure you understand the information. If you have any questions, ask me. Have a good day.